For years, he didn't exist. At least, that's what it felt like to the detectives assigned to his case. Every lead they followed collapsed into nothing. Every name they ran came back clean. Witness descriptions were vague, surveillance footage was useless, and whatever trail he once left behind had completely disappeared. The crimes were real, there was no doubt about that, but the person behind them seemed to dissolve into the air. Investigators were chasing a ghost who never slipped up, never panicked, and never acted like someone on the run. He didn't flee the country or change his identity. He stayed exactly where no one thought to look, among ordinary people, living an ordinary life. That's what made this case so disturbing. The longer he stayed free, the more it became clear that he wasn't surviving by luck. He was surviving because he understood something most criminals don't, that the safest place to hide is in plain sight. And for years, it worked perfectly. Until one day, he made a mistake so small and so unbelievably careless that it shattered everything he had built in seconds. To understand how this happened, you have to understand why the police were completely stuck. Detectives usually rely on patterns, behavioral tells, emotional pressure, desperation. But this man gave them nothing. He didn't brag. He didn't return to the scene. He didn't contact anyone who could expose him. Time passed, the case went cold, and the world moved on. New crimes demanded attention. Old files gathered dust. Even the officers who once swore they'd never forget his face began to doubt they'd ever find him. And that's when he started to believe it too. Years of freedom have a way of changing a person. They replace fear with confidence and confidence with arrogance. The danger stops feeling real. The rules start to feel optional. And without realizing it, he crossed the line he had avoided for years. One ridiculous, almost laughable decision, something no criminal mastermind would ever plan, put him back on the radar. In a matter of days, investigators went from having nothing to having everything. This is the story of how patience beat intelligence, how time betrayed a perfect escape, and how a man cops couldn't have found for years finally exposed himself without anyone forcing him to. For a long time, the case didn't feel real anymore. It existed only as a folder on a shelf, its edges worn soft from being handled too many times and then forgotten. Inside were photos, notes, witness statements, and theories that once felt urgent but now seemed frozen in another era. The crime itself had shaken the community when it first happened, but shock fades faster than people expect. New stories replaced it. New fears took its place. And slowly, without anyone officially saying it out loud, the search for the man responsible faded into the background. Detectives moved on to newer cases. Witnesses stopped returning calls. Even the people most affected learned how to live with unanswered questions. What no one realized was that the man they were looking for hadn't gone far at all. He hadn't escaped under cover of darkness or crossed borders with a fake passport. He didn't disappear. He blended. From the very beginning, investigators assumed he would act like most criminals do. They expected panic, recklessness, or some visible attempt to erase himself. They believed he would run or hide or slip up under pressure. But he did none of those things. He stayed calm. He stayed patient. And most importantly, he stayed normal. He continued waking up at the same time every morning. He kept working. He shopped for groceries. He spoke to neighbors. He lived the kind of life no one ever questions. That was his greatest protection. Because when police look for suspects, they look for people who behave like suspects. And he didn't. As months turned into years, the investigation stalled. Every potential lead led nowhere. Tips came in occasionally, but none of them held up. Descriptions conflicted. Alibis couldn't be disproven. Surveillance footage, when it existed at all, was too grainy to be useful. The technology that might have helped simply didn't exist yet. Each time detectives reopened the file, they hoped they'd notice something new, some overlooked detail, some pattern they had missed. But the truth was painfully simple. The man they were looking for had made no detectable mistakes. He hadn't left a digital footprint. He hadn't told anyone what he'd done. He hadn't tried to relive the crime or insert himself into the investigation. He understood something that most criminals never do, that silence is more powerful than action. Over time, the case took on a strange reputation within the department. Newer officers heard about it in passing, usually framed as a mystery that would probably never be solved. Older detectives spoke about it with frustration, insisting that the answer was right there, hiding somewhere obvious. But even they couldn't say where. The man became less of a suspect and more of a concept, an unknown figure defined only by absence. And that absence made him feel untouchable. Somewhere along the way, he realized that too. Years of freedom changed the way fear works. At first, fear is loud. It keeps you awake at night. It makes you jump at every sound. But as time passes and nothing happens, fear quiets down. It becomes background noise. Then it fades entirely. That's when confidence takes over. And confidence is dangerous. Because confidence convinces you that you were never in danger to begin with. It tells you that the system failed, not temporarily, but permanently. And once a person believes that, they start behaving differently. Subtly at first, then more openly. The man who once checked over his shoulder now walked freely. The man who once measured every word stopped thinking before he spoke. He wasn't trying to get caught. He simply no longer believed he could. What finally exposed him wasn't a grand mistake or a dramatic confession. It wasn't cutting-edge forensic science or a brilliant detective's intuition. It was something painfully ordinary, something stupid, something so small that no one would think it mattered. And that's why it worked. Because after years of perfection, he stopped protecting himself from the simplest risks. He made a choice that felt harmless in the moment. A decision he'd made 100 times before without consequence. Only this time, the world had changed. The systems he thought were irrelevant were now watching. The detail he ignored was suddenly significant. And the ghost finally left a shadow. The first sign that something had shifted didn't come from a dramatic arrest or a public announcement. It came from a quiet notification, a flag raised by a system designed to notice patterns humans often miss. At first, it didn't seem important. Just another data point among millions. But when investigators looked closer, they noticed something that didn't sit right. A name, a date, a behavior that aligned just a little too well with the old case file. One connection became two became three. And slowly, impossibly, the picture began to form. The man they'd been chasing for years wasn't gone. He was right there. He always had been. As detectives retraced his steps with fresh eyes, they saw what they'd missed before. Not because they were careless, but because the world hadn't been ready to see it yet. His normal life wasn't proof of innocence. It was camouflage. His consistency wasn't stability. It was strategy. And the ridiculous mistake he made wasn't a fluke. It was the natural end of a long deception. Because no one can live a lie forever without forgetting which parts matter most. By the time police moved in, there was no chase, no resistance, no dramatic final words. Just shock. Genuine, visible shock on the face of a man who truly believed he had beaten the system. As officers placed him in handcuffs, witnesses later said he looked confused, not angry, not afraid, just stunned. As if he couldn't understand how something so small had undone something so carefully constructed. In that moment, years of freedom collapsed into a single realization. He hadn't been smarter than the police. He'd just been luckier. And luck always runs out. For the first few weeks after the crime, everything felt urgent. Police lights flashed through quiet streets late into the night. Patrol cars rolled slowly past houses where curtains twitched and doors stayed locked. Detectives worked long hours fueled by bad coffee and adrenaline, convinced the answer was close. They believed someone had seen something. Someone always does. Crimes like this don't happen in a vacuum. They leave ripples, footprints, conversations, mistakes. And yet, every time investigators thought they had something solid, it dissolved under scrutiny. Witnesses contradicted each other. Timelines didn't align. What looked promising in the morning fell apart by nightfall. Still, no one panicked. Not yet, because in the early days of an investigation, hope is abundant. You believe effort alone will be enough. The man responsible felt the pressure immediately. He watched the response carefully, not with excitement or fear, but with calculation. He paid attention to what police said publicly and what they didn't. He listened to rumors, noted where patrols concentrated, and learned quickly which areas mattered most to investigators. But unlike many criminals, he didn't react impulsively. He didn't try to destroy evidence in a frenzy or suddenly change his life overnight. He understood that drastic change attracts attention. Instead, he did the opposite. He stayed exactly the same. Same routine, same habits, same face in the same places. And that decision, more than anything else, kept him safe. Days passed, then weeks. Media coverage slowed as new stories took over. Detectives kept working, but the urgency softened to routine. The crime scene was processed again and again, but it yielded nothing new. Evidence that once felt meaningful now seemed frustratingly incomplete. No usable DNA, no clear fingerprints, no confirmed eyewitnesses. The case was real, the harm undeniable, but the person behind it remained just out of reach. And slowly, an uncomfortable truth began to settle in. Whoever had done this knew exactly how not to be caught. As the investigation stretched on, frustration grew inside the department. Meetings became quieter. Fewer ideas were thrown around. The same theories resurfaced again and again, each one weaker than the last. Detectives began to second-guess themselves. Had they missed something obvious early on? Had they focused too narrowly? Or was this one of those rare cases where the suspect truly left nothing behind? These questions haunted the team, because every unanswered question felt like personal failure. And still, the man at the center of it all remained untouched, living a life so normal it was almost invisible. Fear controlled him in the beginning. Every knock at the door sent his heart racing. Every unknown number on his phone made his stomach tighten. He replayed conversations obsessively, analyzing his own words for cracks. But fear is exhausting. It burns hot and fast, and if nothing feeds it, it slowly dies. When weeks passed without police contact, fear softened. When months passed, it faded further. By the time a year had gone by, fear had transformed into something far more dangerous: confidence. Confidence whispered that the worst was over, that if police hadn't found him by now, they never would, that the system had limits, and he had stayed just beyond them. He began to sleep better, laugh more freely, think less about what had happened. The crime stopped feeling like something connected to him and started feeling like a story from someone else's life. That psychological distance mattered. It allowed him to relax. And relaxation leads to mistakes, even if they don't look like mistakes at the time. Inside the department, the case officially became cold. Not because anyone gave up, but because resources had to be allocated elsewhere. New crimes demanded attention. Fresh victims needed justice. The file was archived, its contents preserved but untouched. Occasionally, a detective would pull it out, flip through the pages, and shake their head. They'd talk about it with a mix of frustration and curiosity, wondering how someone could disappear so completely without ever leaving the area. It became a quiet legend, a case that refused to resolve. Years passed like this. The world changed. Technology advanced. Systems that once couldn't communicate were now interconnected. Databases expanded. Surveillance improved. Patterns that once required human intuition could now be identified by algorithms. But the man didn't notice these changes. Why would he? Nothing had happened to him. His life had moved forward without consequence. He believed the danger had passed because, for him, it had. The mistake he made didn't feel like a mistake at all. It felt ordinary, safe, almost boring. That's why it worked. He engaged with something he had avoided for years, not because he forgot the rules, but because he believed the rules no longer applied to him. He didn't disguise himself or act suspiciously. He acted like someone with nothing to fear. And in doing so, he stepped directly into a system designed to catch exactly that kind of confidence. At first, nothing happened. No immediate response. No confrontation. That's the part most people misunderstand about modern investigations. Breakthroughs rarely look dramatic in the moment. They start quietly, with a single data point that doesn't quite fit. In this case, it was flagged by someone who had never heard of the original crime. Someone detached. Someone whose job was simply to notice anomalies. They didn't know they were looking at the beginning of the end. They just knew something felt off. That small flag triggered a review. Then another. Slowly, pieces that had never been connected before were laid side by side. Timelines overlapped. Locations aligned. Behavior patterns matched too closely to be coincidence. What once looked like random noise now formed a shape. And that shape pointed to a man no one had suspected for years. Not because he was clever, but because he was boring. Detectives reopened the case without fanfare. No press conferences, no warnings. They watched quietly, verified information, tracked movements. And with each confirmation, the truth became harder to ignore. The man they'd been chasing hadn't escaped. He had waited them out. And now, because of one ridiculous, careless decision, the waiting was over.